The VCSE Barometer survey. The sector's regular temperature check. Informed by VCSE organisations for VCSE organisations nationwide. Unlock insights for impact.
Everybody for coming for this our latest barometer, which is Wave 12, which we conducted from the middle of October to the middle of November, which, for those of you who haven't seen this before, then this is our quarterly temperature check of the sector, which we ran as a quarterly barometer in November 2022, and before that we're running it during COVID as well. And the idea of the barometer is to provide real-time insights for policymakers and practitioners to really help inform the decisions that people make, and we develop up the questions alongside 14 national partners as well. And thank you everybody for A, coming today, and B, for taking part in the barometer as well. It really means a lot for us, and it really helps make the barometer what it is. If we go on to the next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot of the findings, and I'll hand over to Ben, who will be able to talk you through these sort of things in more details. But you can see from Wave 12 what the main concerns. Income generation continues to be I think the biggest concern has been for quite a long time for people within the sector, as has rising demand. But we've seen, I think more recently, inflation of goods and services is particularly beginning to bite as well, and that's had a significant impact on organisations. 7 in 10 organisations are seeing an increased demand for services as well. And the financial position is very mixed, I think it's fair to say, with 27% saying that it's improved, but 36% saying deteriorated and 37% saying unchanged. So I think there's a real mixed picture, but of those who it's deteriorated, then 67% saying because of rising costs, which has meant that organisations, 44% of organisations are unexpectedly using reserves. 37% increased the price of their services, but as we know, that's a really difficult and challenging thing for organisations to consider. And then an increased responsibility or use of volunteer hours as well, with 27% of organisations often bringing in volunteers where paid staff would have been there as well. And we can see significant recruitment difficulties of volunteers, in particular, with 52% of organisations saying that, again leading to increased volunteers working longer hours, employees working longer hours as well. 31% of organisations have now paused some of their operations, and 24% saying they're unable to meet demand. So we can see significant challenges arising as well. We're going to dig into these. If people would like to put questions, then either put them in the chat, and then right at the end we'll have room for sort of a discussion, really, and I think that's always an interesting part of these presentations. So I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's going to talk you through this in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So what we thought we'd do for this wave is just do a quick snapshot of the core findings, because they're relatively similar each wave. So as Daniel said, one of the things that we've noticed in this wave is a kind of a steady increase in the inflation, the number of organisations saying that inflation of goods and services is a top concern. Something else that we'll discuss in a bit more detail in the topical question set later on is, one, volunteers working increased hours as some implications of recent events over the past year, and two, the common use of reserves to meet general operating costs become a core theme. So this chart here shows some longitudinal data. So as Daniel said, we started the barometer back in November 2022, so we've got a few years of data now. This shows just over a year, so obviously we do the barometer quarterly. So we can see at the top here, this is demand increased and this is demand decreased. So this is the proportion of organisations that tell us if demand is increased and demand is decreased. And on the x-axis here, this is in chronological order from October 2024 to the latest wave, wave 12. Just got a message from Jane saying no chart shown. Can everyone else see the chart on the screen okay?
I can see it.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Maybe, so what we'll do, Jane, is we'll send you a copy of this chart afterwards so you can see it, but I'll briefly explain it. So like we were saying, that these are around the core questions that we ask each wave in the barometer, and they are relatively similar, but this just gives a kind of an indication of what people are saying each wave and whether there are any upward trends or downward trends. And what we've got in here are kind of some of the key events which influence or affect the voluntary sector. So we've got things like last year's autumn budget, this year's autumn budget, things like rises in ENICs and last national living wage, and whether that has any influence on the trends that we can see here. And so one of the things that we've seen is from the start of last year and about a year before then, we noticed that an increase in proportion of organisations were telling us that their financial position had deteriorated, and that's kind of continued through 2025 as well. It seems to have mellowed out a little bit, but it's still much higher than it was back in 2022 and 2023. Similarly, demand, the proportion of organisations saying that the demand has increased has consistently been around 2/3 of organisations. So this just gives a kind of an indication as to some of the trends. Again, what this chart shows is how the top concerns have changed or rather stayed the same over time. So as Daniel mentioned there at the start, the inflation of goods and services, something that we've seen rise, and that we can see there, that's kind of steadily risen over time. Volunteer recruitment sort of hovering around 40%. Rising demand, around half of organisations have told us that each wave. It's probably become a theme where it's organisations have maybe become used to coping with consistently increasing demand each wave. And the top one, of course, is always generating income, which has just peaked over 81%, the highest it's been over the last year. So in the topical question set in wave 12, we want to explore a bit more about organisations' funding, how they're managing their finances, where their income comes from, and the challenges they face with the precarious financial position and the competitive funding landscape. So we asked organisations over the past 12 months, so I'm not sure, that's not come up there, but all this is on the right hand side is a legend. So in the green, we've got improved. In the red, we've got deteriorated. So the darker red is deteriorated a lot. The more bold green is improved a lot. So we can see there that almost half of organisations said that their financial position has deteriorated over the past 12 months. And this is sort of similar in keeping with what we see on a quarterly basis, although it's usually just over a third. So this is a little bit more negative than we'd normally see on a quarterly basis. So this chart here shows the change in income from different sources over the past 12 months. So we've got another slide on the next one, which shows just the applicable answers, but I thought I'd just show you this one first to illustrate the not applicable responses, so we can see where organisations primarily receive their income. So the main areas where organisations receive their income, places like public donations, grants from trusts and foundations, and we can see at the other end, fewer organisations receive it from places like payroll giving. Interestingly, UK national government grants is also up there, maybe sort of in line with our sample. We have more large organisations in our sample than we've been increasingly having more large organisations in our sample recently, but it's mostly comprised of small organisations who maybe go for more local authority grants as opposed to the national ones. So again, this just shows this same thing, but it removes all the not applicable options. So this basically shows whether the income that they receive from different sources over the past 12 months has increased, stayed the same, or decreased. And obviously this is only for the ones that actually receive income from these different sources. So there are a mix of increases and decreases. Obviously, you can see there the largest proportion of selected sort of stayed the same, and that's the case for most of them. But in terms of the standouts on either side, around 2 in 5 report decreases in income from local authority grants over the past 12 months, compared to 1 in 5 reporting increases. More than 1 in 3 report decreases from grants from trusts and foundations, compared to 1 in 5 reporting increases. And more than 1 in 3 report decreases from UK government grants, with 1 in 6 reporting increases. At the other end, more than 1 in 4 reported increases in trading income, and legacy giving, service delivery contracts, and corporate support as well. The caveat is that the proportion of organisations reporting decreases in the same areas is either very similar or higher than those reporting increases. And I guess this somewhat reflects the financial position over the past 12 months, in that it's a mixed picture, but largely negative outweighs the positive. So what this shows is the success rate in funding applications for different sources. So we've filtered out the non-applicants, and we've just left in those that have applied for these different income sources. So I'll briefly tell you just about the proportion of those organisations in terms of the non-applicants. So just under 3/4 did not apply for UK national government grants, 2 in 3 did not apply for service delivery contracts, half didn't apply for local authority grants, and 1/4 did not apply for grants from trusts and foundations. So that suggests that most of our sample were more likely to apply for grants from trusts and foundations and local authority grants. For those that did apply, 8 in 10 reported at least some success with service delivery contracts, and almost 3/4 reported some level of success in local authority grants, with around 1/4 reported being very successful. So we don't look specifically at the geographic scope of service delivery contracts, but we can infer that these are probably more likely to come from local government, with some recent research showing that the majority of service contracts come from local government. Around 8 in 10 only work with contracting authorities in a single region. Fewer were very successful with grants from trusts and foundations, but around half that applied had at least some success. And those that were applying to UK national government grants were more of a mixed bunch, and each of these 4 response options broadly received a similar proportion, with a more even split of unsuccessful versus successful. And so what this shows is it's a stacked bar chart, which shows the extent to which full cost recovery is included in full applications, and whether full costs are actually covered when funding is awarded. And we can see at the top that most people include full costs in funding applications, most or always. And this bit here is, very few people include them, rarely or never. But actually, when funding is awarded, it's a much lower proportion that say that full costs are actually included when that funding is awarded. So given declining government funding in recent years, and that's been quite widely publicised, we pivoted to a more specific focus on public contracts and grants. We asked those receiving public contracts or grants how often they provided multi-year funding, and we found that 1 in 6 organisations regularly receive multi-year funding. 2 in 5 sometimes receive it, while almost half either rarely or never receive it. Again, I don't think the legend's shown up here, but you can infer from the colours, which is
I've also
good.
just put it in the chat, Ben, as well.
Okay, so thanks. Yeah, I mean, hopefully the colours are quite clear in terms of red bad, green good. So something that's been introduced more recently and that's meant to be coming into effect in April 2026 is the National Procurement Policy Statement. And that's been introduced alongside the Procurement Act, and explicitly sets as a government priority to maximise procurement spend with SMEs, but also VCSE organisations. So contracting authorities are required to set 2-year targets for direct spend with VCSE organisations from April 2026. So that's meant to help with things like this. However, there's nothing in there about multi-year funding, and obviously this is an area which is a clear problem, and it suggests that these public grants and contracts are more likely to be short-term, and if they're setting those targets, we would hope that they provide multi-year funding as part of that. So to the same cohort of organisations, we asked what proportion of the public grants and contracts they received had been uplifted over the past year. And more than half told us that none of the grants or contracts they held had been uplifted. Around a quarter told us that a small proportion had been uplifted, and very few reported uplifts in the majority of their grants and contracts. We then asked those that had received at least some uplifts, so it's quite a small proportion there, whether those uplifts covered the true costs of delivering services. And we know from previous research that many organisations in the voluntary sector have been subsidising contracts due to lack of uplifts. So half of those organisations receiving uplifts told us that they only covered part of the costs, the true cost of delivering services. And just under 3 said that they covered most of all the full costs. So you can see there only 4% of the uplifts fully covered the true cost of delivering services. Around 1 in 6 said that it didn't cover the true cost at all. So in terms of the implications of some of these things, like I was saying earlier, over recent waves, we've noticed that around half of organisations are using reserves to meet operating costs. And while many are dipping into reserves to cope with ongoing challenges with rising costs, and given the increasing number of organisations that are concerned about the inflation of goods and services, we don't really expect this trend to change anytime soon, I think it's safe to say. So we asked organisations whether they had been using reserves to support their organisation's operations over the past year. And as I said, just over half, 51%, said yes. And we asked for what reasons they'd been using reserves. As you can see there, the overwhelming majority told us that it was to meet general operating costs. Next, but significantly less, was to plug gaps in funding, and 1 in 4 said they were using them to subsidise other non-contracted services. So in wave 9, we had a question set on the anticipated or expected impact of rising employer national insurance contributions and national living wage rises. And we just thought we'd ask this question again in terms of the actual impact that they'd had. This was relatively similar to the percentages that we've seen in wave 9. Were around, so this chart here shows with and without paid staff, but overall it showed around half were neutral, 1 in 3 had slightly negative expectations, and 1 in 5 were expecting a negative, very negative impact. But naturally, we expected those with paid workforce to feel the pinch most, and this was indeed the case. 74% of those with a paid workforce expected a negative impact, compared to only 13% without a paid workforce. And again, this was very similar to the experiences reported in wave 12, where 68% of those with a paid workforce reported an actual negative impact, compared to 7% of those without a paid workforce. So yeah, this isn't really telling you anything new, but I guess it validates the concerns raised in wave 9. Okay, so this one is showing the changes to staffing and overheads in response to ERNICS and the national living wage. And in wave 9, organisations expecting to make changes to staffing and overheads, 27% of them said yes, We asked them again in wave 12 whether they'd actually made changes to staffing and overheads, and 21% said yes. Again, those with a paid workforce, much more likely to make those changes. Obviously, those with a paid workforce more likely to be medium and large organisations compared to small organisations. And so 58% of large organisations had made changes compared to 25% of medium and 6% of small organisations, again reflecting the likelihood of those with more paid staff. And so when asked about the changes that they had made, there was a clear theme in terms of decreasing staff numbers or hours, reducing costs, predominantly in non-essential spending, and an increasing reliance on volunteers. And this was largely in line with the expectations that people had in Wave 9. The only real sort of difference, and it wasn't really much of a difference, was around half expected to decrease spend on outsourced services, but actually only a third here told us that they just decrease spend. Having said that, it's, you know, given that it's 21% of our sample here, it's quite a small sample, so you have to take that with a pinch of salt. So almost half made changes, reported staff redundancies, and no organisations cited a decrease in redundancies. So you can see here the light blue is increased, and the cream colour is no change, and there's no decrease at all in staff redundancies. And around half said they had reduced the recruitment of paid staff, so again declining staff numbers. Naturally, with the policy changes, increase in staff pay for a lot of people. And again, in terms of spend, so fairly big decreases on equipment or technology spend, around half said that, very few citing increases, and non-essential spend, unsurprisingly, decreased as well. And again, you know, the biggest one, I think, reliance on volunteers, especially given the current landscape in terms of volunteer recruitment being consistently a top concern over the past few years. So in terms of reflections, the trends data that I showed at the start, I think, showed a persistent rise in organisations being concerned about inflation of goods and services. I think rising costs have always been a challenge, but coupled with the other challenges over the past few years, such as decline in government funds, a more competitive funding landscape in general, consistently rising demand in services. We've just seen recently some research around declining public donations as well, given that that's a primary source for a lot of especially smaller organisations. Those financial pressures are persisting, and our findings echo wider evidence that public funding tends to be short term. Only 1 in 6 receive multi-year public funding, often or always. They also rarely cover full costs, despite most organisations including those full costs in the applications. When costs are rising, uplifts are important to cover the true cost of delivering services, but over half of our sample say that none of the public grants and contracts have seen uplifts in the past year. And for the small proportion that did receive uplifts, most said that it was only partly covered the cost of delivering services. Half of organisations have used reserves over the past year, and they seem to be using these reserves for core operational costs, which are potentially not being covered in the funding they receive, and to plug gaps in funding. And finally, our revisiting of the impact of employer national insurance contributions and the national living wage showed that one organisation's concerns were valid, and while the impact disproportionately affects those with paid staff, I think there's also a human element involved in that staff are being made redundant, but also volunteers are having to take on more responsibilities. So I'll pass back to Daniel for the Q&A.
Yeah, actually, do you want to just put the last slide up, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So just going to put the links in the chat as well. Somebody could just put the link to the barometer. I've just put, thank you very much, Ganesh, for that. So we've just put the links to our website and the barometer and a sample of the individual reports as well. So the next wave is going to be on the 21st of January to the 11th of February. And then you've got the links there for the dashboard. We will be producing a report which will be coming out hopefully next week as well. And then yeah, we've got our dashboard that you can interact and drill down into this. We've currently got a few of the waves on there. We will be soon having every single wave available on the dashboard as well. We've just got a bit more work to clean that up. And it's really nice to see people in the chat who are using what's being presented as well. We'd love to hear more stories of that. So we're going to stop the slides there, be really and open it up to a discussion.
See where you are in the big picture. Stay ahead of the curve. Join a community of changemakers. Amplify your voice. Drive collaboration and innovation. Sign up for the survey. Have your say. And influence action where it counts. For you. Your input matters.